The phone slipped from Eleanor Morrison's trembling fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor of her empty Montana kitchen at 3:17 a.m. Coffee from her overturned mug spread across 5 years of unopened condolence cards scattered on the table. "Mrs. Morrison, your son Marcus didn't die in a hunting accident." The voice from Kenya had shattered everything she believed about her dead boy. Her neighbor's porch light flickered on next door. Mrs. Henderson's silhouette appeared at her window, drawn by Eleanor's involuntary cry that pierced the prairie silence. The old house groaned around Eleanor, as if mourning alongside her, every shadow suddenly holding secrets about the son she'd buried, believing he died chasing foolish dreams in African wilderness. She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart hammer against brittle ribs. Marcus had called her 17 times the night he died, calls she'd ignored because she was tired of his adventures. What truth about her boy's death had been hidden from her all these years? And why was someone telling her now? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor Morrison had lived 72 years in the same weathered farmhouse outside Billings, Montana, where the wind never stopped whispering through the wheat fields and loneliness had become her most faithful companion. The house that once echoed with her husband Robert's laughter and Marcus's childhood adventures now held only the tick of an ancient grandfather clock and the weight of her regrets. She'd been a nurse for 43 years at Billings General, tending to broken bodies while her own heart slowly cracked. Robert died of a heart attack 20 years ago, leaving her to raise Marcus alone. She'd done her best, worked double shifts to pay for his college, sacrificed her own dreams so he could chase his. But somehow, love had gotten tangled up with disappointment, and by the time Marcus graduated with a degree in wildlife photography, their conversations had become battlefields. "You're wasting your life taking pictures of animals," she told him during their last phone call. "When are you going to settle down, find a real job, give me grandchildren?" Her words still haunted the empty rooms. Sharp, practical words from a practical woman who'd survived the Depression's echoes and believed security mattered more than passion. Marcus had died 5 years ago in Kenya, supposedly while hunting big game. The final insult to Eleanor's sensibilities. Her artistic, gentle son had become, in her mind, just another rich American tourist seeking trophies. She'd buried him believing he'd died pursuing the very recklessness she'd spent his lifetime warning him against. The ranch-style house felt cavernous now, filled with Medicare statements and church bulletins, photographs of Marcus growing progressively distant through the years. His bedroom remained untouched, Spider-Man posters and nature magazines creating a shrine to the boy she'd loved before he became the man she couldn't understand. Eleanor survived on Social Security and her late husband's modest pension, too proud to admit financial struggles to anyone at First Baptist Church, where she taught Sunday school with the same methodical devotion she'd once brought to changing IV bags. Pastor Williams often asked if she needed anything, but Eleanor Morrison had never been the type to accept charity. Her only real friend was Martha Henderson next door, a widow who brought casseroles and gossip in equal measure. They'd sit on Eleanor's front porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over endless Montana sky, talking about everything except the grief that followed them like shadows. The phone call from Kenya had shattered her carefully constructed widow's routine. For 5 years, she'd believed Marcus died selfishly, pursuing dangerous thrills. But the stranger's voice, Dr. David Chen, he'd said, suggested something else entirely, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her son's final months. Now, as dawn crept across the wheat fields, Eleanor sat among the scattered condolence cards she'd never had the strength to read, wondering if the boy she'd failed to understand had been hiding truths that might change everything about how she remembered him. Eleanor's hands shook as she dialed the number Dr. Chen had left, each digit feeling like a step toward a precipice she wasn't sure she could survive. The international connection crackled with distance and possibility, carrying her voice across oceans to a world she'd never imagined visiting. "Mrs. Morrison?" David Chen's voice was gentle, tinged with an accent that spoke of American education layered over something else. "Thank you for calling back. I know this must be overwhelming. You said my son didn't die hunting." Eleanor's words came out sharper than intended, the nurse in her demanding facts over comfort. "What exactly are you telling me, Dr. Chen?" There was a pause filled with static and the weight of unspoken truths. "Marcus was my best friend from veterinary school, Mrs. Morrison. We kept in touch when he moved to Kenya. He wasn't hunting animals, he was protecting them. He died trying to save a pregnant lioness from poachers." The kitchen spun around Eleanor like a carnival ride. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white against the receiver. "That's impossible. The embassy said—" "The embassy was told what the local authorities reported, but I was there, Mrs. Morrison. I saw what really happened." David's voice cracked with emotion. "Marcus spent his last 2 years documenting poaching networks, gathering evidence, working with anti-poaching units. He was one of the bravest men I've ever known." Eleanor sank into Robert's old recliner, the leather worn smooth by decades of evening news and Sunday football. Everything she'd believed about Marcus's death was crumbling like old newspaper. "Why didn't you tell me this before? It's been 5 years." "Because I was a coward." The honesty in David's voice was brutal. "Marcus made me promise that if anything happened to him, I wouldn't burden you with guilt. He knew you disapproved of his choices and he didn't want you blaming yourself. But I've carried this secret for too long and you deserve to know who your son really was." Through the kitchen window, Eleanor watched Martha Henderson hanging laundry on the line, moving with the careful precision of arthritis and age. Normal life continuing while her world reconstructed itself around impossible truths. "You're saying my son was some kind of hero?" "He was exactly the man you raised him to be, Mrs. Morrison. Compassionate, brave, willing to sacrifice for others. Just like his mother, the nurse who spent her life healing people." David paused, and Eleanor could hear voices in the background speaking in languages she didn't recognize. "There's someone else who wants to talk to you. Sarah Whitmore. She's a journalist who's been investigating Marcus's story." A new voice came on the line, crisp and professional. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Sarah Whitmore with National Geographic. I've been documenting wildlife crime in East Africa, and your son's story became part of my investigation. He saved lives, ma'am, both human and animal. His documentation helped shut down 3 major poaching operations." Eleanor felt tears she hadn't cried in years burning behind her eyes. "I called him selfish. I told him he was wasting his life chasing fantasies." "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah's voice softened, "your son kept every letter you ever sent him. He had photos of you and his father all over his tent. He talked about you constantly, how proud he was that you dedicated your life to saving others. He wanted to make you proud by doing the same thing, just in a different way." The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, marking another hour in a life suddenly stretched between past and present, truth and assumption. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to reconcile the son she'd mourned with the hero these strangers were describing. "I want to see where he died," she heard herself saying, the words surprising her as much as they seemed to surprise the people on the other end of the line. "I want to understand what he was doing there." "Mrs. Morrison, Kenya is very different from Montana," David said carefully. "The travel alone—" "I'm 72, not dead," Eleanor interrupted, finding strength in her voice she hadn't felt in years. "If my son could face down poachers to save animals, I can face an airplane to learn the truth about his life." Sarah spoke up again. "Ma'am, I'd be honored to arrange your travel. National Geographic has been wanting to tell Marcus's story properly, and having his mother there—" "I don't want to be part of some magazine story," Eleanor said firmly. I want to see the place where my son chose to die. I want to understand why protecting animals was worth more to him than coming home to me." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor realized she'd just committed to the most terrifying journey of her life. But for the first time since Marcus's death, she felt something other than regret driving her forward. She felt the stirring of pride and the desperate need to finally meet the son she'd never really known. The Boeing 707 descended through clouds over Nairobi like a prayer seeking Earth, carrying Eleanor Morrison toward truths she'd spent 5 years avoiding. Her arthritic hands gripped the armrest as Africa revealed itself below, a tapestry of red earth and endless sky that seemed to mock the orderly wheat fields of Montana. At 72, this was her first passport, her first journey beyond the familiar boundaries of American soil. The Jomo Kenyatta International Airport overwhelmed her senses with heat, languages that danced around her ears like exotic birds, and the press of humanity moving with purpose she couldn't fathom. Eleanor stood frozen in the arrival hall, clutching her single suitcase and searching for the face she'd only seen in a grainy photograph David had emailed her. "Mrs. Morrison?" A tall Asian man approached with careful steps, his eyes holding the kind of professional compassion Eleanor recognized from her nursing years. "I'm David Chen." "Welcome to Kenya." She studied his face, searching for clues about the man who'd known her son better than she had. "You look younger than I expected. Marcus always said you were direct." David's smile was gentle but strained. "The drive to Masai Mara will take about 6 hours. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Eleanor adjusted her grip on her purse, feeling the weight of Marcus's last letter inside, the one she'd never opened, too angry to read his words when they'd arrived 3 days after the funeral. "I've been ready for 5 years. I just didn't know it." The Toyota Land Cruiser jolted along roads that transformed from pavement to dust, past settlements that seemed to spring from the earth itself. David drove with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate between worlds, pointing out landmarks while carefully avoiding the larger conversation that hung between them like humidity. "Tell me about the animals Marcus photographed," Eleanor said, watching zebras graze in the distance with the casual indifference of Montana cattle. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He didn't just photograph them, Mrs. Morrison. He became obsessed with protecting them, especially the lions. There was this pride." He stopped himself, as if catching words before they revealed too much. "What pride?" "The one he died protecting." David pulled over at a scenic overlook, the Rift Valley spreading below them like God's own amphitheater. "Mrs. Morrison, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What happened to Marcus? It wasn't random. He chose to be there that night. He chose to stay when he could have escaped." Eleanor stepped out of the vehicle, her legs unsteady from travel and revelation. The African wind carried scents she had no names for, sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Show me." David opened his laptop, the screen incongruous against the ancient landscape. The video began with Marcus's voice, younger and more excited than Eleanor remembered. He was filming a group of lions, a magnificent male with a golden mane and several females with cubs playing in tall grass. "This is Django," Marcus's voice narrated, the camera focusing on a particular lion cub with distinctive markings around his eyes. "His mother, Zara, is pregnant again. The pride has been targeted by poachers 3 times this month. Tonight we're setting up camera traps to document any intrusions." Eleanor watched her son's hands move confidently behind the camera, noting the calluses she'd never seen, the careful way he approached the animals with respect rather than fear. "He's so comfortable with them." "They trusted him completely," David said quietly. "Marcus spent months earning that trust. He'd sit with them for hours, just watching, learning their personalities." "That's Django there. He was just 8 months old then." The video shifted to night vision footage, green and ghostly. Eleanor could hear Marcus whispering instructions to someone off camera, his voice tight with tension. "They're coming from the north. 3 vehicles. Sarah, are you getting this?" Sarah Whitmore was there. She was documenting Marcus's work. They'd been collaborating for 6 months. David paused the video, his face shadowed with old grief. "Mrs. Morrison, what you're about to see." Marcus had a choice. He could have retreated to safety, but Zara was in labor, vulnerable. The other lions wouldn't leave her. Eleanor's breath caught as the video resumed. Through the green haze of night vision, she could see muzzle flashes, hear the crack of gunfire. Marcus's camera shook as he moved, but his voice remained steady, professional even as chaos erupted around him. "They're after the cubs," he said, breathing hard. "I can't let them take the cubs." The image went black. David closed the laptop with trembling hands. That was the last footage we recovered from his camera. Eleanor stood in the African wind, feeling it strip away layers of assumption and misunderstanding she'd carried for 5 years. Her practical, cautious son had become someone she'd never imagined. A man who'd chosen courage over safety, purpose over comfort. "Where is he buried?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Mrs. Morrison." "Where is my son buried, Dr. Chen?" David pointed toward the horizon where the Masai Mara stretched endlessly under the late afternoon sun. "About 40 kilometers that way, near where Django's pride still lives." He hesitated, then continued. "Django survived that night. He's a full-grown male now with a pride of his own. Sometimes I think he remembers Marcus." Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, not the familiar pain of loss, but something larger and more frightening. Pride. Her son had died a hero, and she'd spent 5 years mourning him as a reckless fool. "I want to see them," she said firmly. "I want to see the lions my son died for." David studied her face, seeing perhaps the same stubborn determination that had driven Marcus to stay in the path of danger rather than abandon the vulnerable. "Mrs. Morrison, there's more you need to know about that night, about the choices Marcus made." "Then tell me everything," Eleanor said, squaring her shoulders against the African sky. "I'm done living with half-truths and assumptions. I'm ready to meet my son." The Masai Mara stretched before Eleanor like a living cathedral, golden grass swaying in rhythms older than civilization. David's Land Cruiser navigated game trails with practiced ease while Eleanor pressed her face to the window, trying to see this landscape through Marcus's eyes. Every acacia tree, every termite mound seemed to whisper secrets about the son she was only now beginning to understand. "There," David pointed toward a cluster of vehicles near a watering hole. "Sarah's team is documenting the pride's behavior. They've been studying how Django's leadership style differs from typical male lions." Eleanor could see figures moving around expensive-looking camera equipment, their movements careful and deliberate. As they approached, a woman with sun-weathered skin and prematurely gray hair looked up from her viewfinder. Sarah Whitmore moved with the contained energy of someone accustomed to documenting danger, her eyes holding the same mix of compassion and professional distance Eleanor recognized from her own nursing career. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah extended a firm handshake, "I can't tell you how honored I am to meet you. Marcus talked about you constantly." "Did he?" Eleanor's voice carried decades of doubt. "Because the last conversation we had, he seemed pretty disappointed in his mother." Sarah exchanged a glance with David before responding. "Marcus kept a journal. Every entry mentions you, your strength, your sacrifice, how much he wanted to make you proud. He understood why you worried about his choices." Through the telescopic lens of Sarah's camera, Eleanor saw them, the lions Marcus had died protecting. Django stood magnificent in the afternoon light, his mane fuller and darker than his father's had been in the old video. Around him, lionesses moved with lethal grace while cubs tumbled in play that would one day become hunting technique. "That's him," David said quietly. "Django. He's 8 years old now, in his prime. The two lionesses with the darker coats are his mates, Amara and Kessie. The cubs are about 6 months old." Eleanor studied Django through the lens, noting the distinctive markings around his eyes that matched the cub in Marcus's footage. "He looks intelligent, more aware than I expected." "Lions are incredibly social animals," Sarah explained, adjusting the camera settings. "They form complex emotional bonds, mourn their dead, protect their family groups with fierce loyalty." Marcus understood that. He saw them as individuals, not just subjects for photography. As if sensing their attention, Django raised his head and looked directly toward their vehicle. Eleanor felt an electric shock of recognition, not of the animal itself, but of something in his steady gaze that reminded her of Marcus during his more thoughtful moments. The lion maintained eye contact for several heartbeats before returning his attention to his family. "Marcus's journal is in my tent," Sarah said carefully. "Would you like to read it?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. They drove to the research camp, a collection of canvas tents and solar panels that managed to feel both primitive and sophisticated. Inside Sarah's work tent, laptop computers shared space with traditional African artifacts, creating a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern technology. Sarah handed Eleanor a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed by African dust and frequent handling. "This was in his camera bag when we found him. He wrote in it every night." Eleanor opened to a random page and immediately recognized Marcus's careful handwriting, the same precise script he'd used for school reports and thank-you notes. The entry was dated 3 months before his death. "Watched Zara teach her cubs to hunt today. She's endlessly patient, demonstrating the same stalk 20 times until they get it right. Reminded me of Mom teaching me to tie my shoes. How she'd kneel on the kitchen floor, showing me over and over until I finally got the loops right. I wonder if she knows that her patience, her dedication to getting things right, is what taught me to do this work. Every time I wait hours for the perfect shot, every time I refuse to give up on a difficult story, I'm using lessons she taught me." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she turned pages, discovering a Marcus she'd never known, one who carried her lessons into landscapes she couldn't have imagined. Another entry dated 2 weeks before his death. "Called Mom tonight, but she didn't answer. Can't blame her, our last conversation was awful. I tried to explain about the poaching situation getting worse, about how the work here matters, but all she heard was her son making excuses for avoiding responsibility. How do I tell her that responsibility looks different than she thinks? That sometimes responsibility means staying in dangerous places because someone has to witness what's happening here?" David handed Eleanor a cup of coffee, his movements gentle with understanding. "Marcus never blamed you for worrying about him. He knew you'd lost his father young, that you'd sacrificed everything to raise him alone. He understood your fears." Eleanor continued reading, each page revealing layers of the man her son had become. His observations about lion behavior mixed with philosophical reflections about family, loyalty, and the cost of doing what you believe is right. One passage made her hands tremble. "Django's father was killed by poachers last month. Watched Django trying to understand why his protector was gone, why the pride dynamics have shifted. He keeps looking toward the spot where his father fell, as if expecting him to return. It breaks my heart because I remember doing the same thing after Dad died, watching the driveway, expecting him to come home from work. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to these lions. They understand loss the way our family does." "He was grieving his father too," Eleanor whispered, the realization hitting her like physical blow. "All this time, I thought he was running away from responsibility, but he was trying to honor Robert's memory by protecting families like ours. Sarah sat down across from Eleanor, her expression careful. Mrs. Morrison, there's something else Marcus wrote about. Something that might be difficult to hear. Eleanor looked up from the journal, seeing worry in both Sarah's and David's faces. "A what?" "Read the entries from his last week," Sarah said gently, "especially the one from 2 days before he died." Eleanor's hands shook as she flipped to the final entries. Marcus's handwriting became more urgent, less careful. Intelligence reports indicate major poaching operation planned for this area. They're targeting Zara's pride specifically. Word is that wealthy American hunters are paying premium prices for lions with cubs. The cubs will be sold to private zoos, the adults killed for trophies. I've notified the Kenya Wildlife Service, but their response time is 8 to 12 hours. Zara's labor started this morning. She can't be moved. The next entry was dated the day before Marcus died. Poachers moving tonight. KWS still can't get here until tomorrow morning. Sarah's team is pulling back to safety, but I can't leave. If I document this attack, get evidence of the buyers' identities, we can shut down the entire network. But more than that, I can't watch Zara and her cubs die when I have the power to call for help. I'm going to try calling Mom. If something happens to me, maybe hearing my voice one last time will help her understand that I didn't die being reckless. I died being my mother's son, trying to save lives. Eleanor's coffee cup slipped from numb fingers, shattering against the tent floor. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, as the full implications of Marcus's words settled over her like a shroud. "He called me that night," she whispered. "The night he died. An international number I didn't recognize. I was angry about our fight, tired of his adventures. I rejected the calls and turned off my phone." David and Sarah exchanged glances, heavy with shared knowledge. Eleanor saw the truth in their faces before either spoke. "How many times?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "How many times did he call?" 17, David said quietly. "Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Kenya time. Each call lasted exactly 30 seconds before going to voicemail." Eleanor doubled over as if physically struck, her body rejecting the reality of what she'd done. For 5 years she'd mourned her son's reckless death, never knowing that his final hours had been spent trying to reach her, trying to connect with the mother who'd raised him to save lives. "I killed him," she gasped. "If I'd answered, if I'd called for help." "Mrs. Morrison, no." Sarah knelt beside Eleanor's chair, her voice firm with conviction. "Marcus knew the risks. He chose to stay because that's who he was. Even if you'd answered, even if help had come faster, he wouldn't have abandoned those lions." But Eleanor was spiraling into a darkness deeper than grief, darker than regret. She'd spent her career answering emergency calls, responding to crises, saving lives when every second mattered. And when her own son had needed her most, when he'd called desperately across oceans and time zones, she'd chosen silence and switched off her phone. Through the tent opening she could see Jengo in the distance, standing watch over his pride with the same protective stance Marcus had described in his journal. The lion had survived the night that killed her son, had grown into the protector his father had been, had found ways to honor his legacy by caring for the vulnerable. Eleanor realized with crystal clarity that she'd spent 5 years mourning the wrong loss. She hadn't just lost her son. She'd lost the chance to be the mother he'd needed in his final moments. She'd failed the most important call of her life, and the weight of that failure threatened to crush what remained of her spirit. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. She lay in the spare cot Sarah had set up in the research tent, listening to the African darkness alive with sounds that had no names in her Montana vocabulary. Hyena calls, distant roars, the rustle of grass under hooves, Marcus's final soundtrack playing on eternal repeat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her phone screen lighting up with his international number, saw her own finger deliberately pressing decline again and again. At 4 a.m., she gave up on sleep and walked outside. The Masai Mara under starlight was a cathedral of silver and shadow, the Milky Way spread across the sky like God's own promise. She'd never seen so many stars from her light-polluted Montana home, had never realized how small her world really was. Couldn't sleep either? David's voice came softly from behind her. He emerged from his tent carrying 2 cups of coffee, steam rising like prayers in the cool air. "I keep hearing that phone ring," Eleanor said, accepting the warmth gratefully. 17 times. How desperate must he have been by the end? David settled beside her on a folding chair, his silence more comforting than empty reassurances would have been. In the distance, Django's pride was invisible but somehow present, their breathing part of the night's rhythm. "There's something else," David said finally. "Something I haven't told you yet." Eleanor's heart clenched. "What now?" "The last call Marcus made, it wasn't to you." David's voice was careful, measured. "It was to me. At 3:17 a.m., Kenya time, 13 minutes before the poachers found him." Eleanor turned to stare at David's profile in the starlight. "What did he say?" "He said, 'Tell my mom I understand why she couldn't answer. Tell her I love her anyway.'" David's voice broke on the final words. "He wasn't angry, Mrs. Morrison. Even then, even knowing he was about to die, he was trying to protect you from guilt." The coffee cup trembled in Eleanor's hands. "You're telling me he died making excuses for me?" "I'm telling you he died understanding you." David leaned forward, his words urgent now. "Marcus knew you'd lost his father suddenly, that you lived in fear of losing him too. He understood that your anger came from love, not indifference. His last words weren't about regret. They were about forgiveness." Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of camp where the grassland began. The stars seemed to pulse with Marcus's presence, as if he were watching from whatever place the dead go to wait for the living to catch up. "How am I supposed to live with this?" "The same way Django lived with losing his father," Sarah's voice came from the tent opening. She approached carefully, respecting Eleanor's grief like a dangerous animal. "By honoring the memory through action." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "I'm 72 years old. What action am I supposed to take? I can't bring him back. I can't undo those 17 calls." "But you can finish what he started," Sarah said gently. "The footage Marcus gathered, the evidence he died collecting, it's helped shut down 3 major poaching operations. But there's more work to do. The network he was investigating is still active." "I don't know anything about poaching or wildlife conservation." "But you know about saving lives," David interjected. "You spent 43 years as a nurse. You understand triage, crisis response, what it means to be there when someone needs help. That's exactly what we need here." Eleanor looked toward where she knew Django's pride was sleeping, invisible in the darkness but somehow radiating the peaceful security of family protected. "What would I do?" Sarah pulled out her laptop, the screen harsh against the natural darkness. "Look at this." She showed Eleanor footage from a wildlife hospital 2 hours away. Baby elephants with their tusks hacked off, lion cubs too young to survive without their mothers, rangers wounded in firefights with poachers. This facility needs medical expertise. They need someone who understands trauma, who can coordinate care between human and animal patients. Eleanor studied the images, her nurse's eye automatically cataloging wounds, assessing needs. Despite herself, she felt the familiar pull of crisis medicine, the clarity that came with having essential work to do. "I don't have veterinary training." "But you have something more valuable," David said. "You have Marcus's heart. his determination to heal rather than harm. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten, painting the grassland in subtle pastels. Soon the sun would rise on another day. Eleanor had to navigate without her son, another 24 hours of carrying guilt that felt heavier than her aging bones could bear. "Show me where he died," she said suddenly. "I need to see the exact place." David and Sarah exchanged glances. "Mrs. Morrison, it's not—" "Don't protect me from any more truths," Eleanor interrupted. "I've had enough of being shielded from reality. Take me to where my son chose to make his stand." They drove in pre-dawn silence across terrain that grew progressively wilder, further from the established research camps and tourist routes. David navigated by landmarks Eleanor couldn't read, a particular dead tree, a rock formation, the subtle way the land folded in on itself. Finally, he stopped the vehicle at what looked like any other stretch of African grassland. "Here," he said simply. Eleanor stepped out into grass, still wet with dew, feeling the sacred weight of ground that had absorbed her son's blood. There was nothing to mark the spot. No memorial, no cross, no indication that this random piece of earth had witnessed a hero's death. Just grass and sky, and the eternal indifference of nature. Zara was there. David pointed to a cluster of rocks. In labor, unable to move. The rest of the pride formed a protective circle around her, but they were outnumbered. Eleanor walked slowly toward the rocks, trying to imagine the scene. Darkness, gunfire, her son choosing courage over safety. The grass was trampled here, whether from that terrible night or more recent animal activity, she couldn't tell. "Marcus positioned himself between the poachers and the pride," Sarah continued, her voice respectful in the growing light. "He had night vision equipment, was filming everything. The footage we recovered shows him standing his ground even when they started shooting directly at him." Eleanor knelt where her son had fallen, pressing her palms against earth that might still hold traces of his presence. The morning sun was rising now, painting the Masai Mara in gold that reminded her painfully of Marcus's hair as a child. "Mrs. Morrison," David said softly, "there's one more thing. Something we found with Marcus's body." He handed her a small digital recorder, its surface scratched and stained. "He recorded a message. For you. We've never played it. It seemed too private." Eleanor's hands shook as she took the device. Such a small thing to carry such enormous weight. She looked at the play button, knowing that whatever Marcus had said in his final moments would either destroy her completely or give her a reason to continue living. The sun cleared the horizon, flooding the grassland with warm light that chased away the last shadows of night. Somewhere in the distance, Django roared, a sound of strength and protection that carried across the miles like a promise. Eleanor pressed play, and her son's voice filled the African morning. "Mom, if you're hearing this, then David kept his promise to find you. I know you're angry, and I know you think I'm throwing my life away out here, but I need you to understand something. Everything I learned about protecting people, about refusing to give up when someone needs help, I learned from you. Remember when I was 8 and found that injured bird? You stayed up all night helping me nurse it back to health, even though you had to work a double shift the next day. You taught me that when something needs protecting, you protect it, no matter the cost." Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering that night, a broken-winged sparrow Marcus had found, her exhaustion warring with her inability to disappoint her earnest little boy. "I'm not being reckless, Mom. I'm being your son. The son who learned that saving lives is the most important work anyone can do. I love you. I'm proud to be Eleanor Morrison's boy. And if something happens to me tonight, know that I died the way you taught me to live. putting others first. The recording ended with the distant sound of vehicles approaching, and Marcus's whispered, "They're here. I love you, Mom." Eleanor sat in the grass where her son had died, holding the recorder against her heart as the African sun climbed higher. For the first time in 5 years, she understood that Marcus hadn't died running away from her lessons. He died embodying them completely. Eleanor collapsed onto the African earth where Marcus had died, her 72-year-old body finally succumbing to the weight of unbearable truth. The recorder slipped from her fingers as sobs tore through her chest. 5 years of misdirected grief transforming into something far more devastating. She had raised a hero and spent half a decade mourning him as a fool. "I failed him," she gasped between breaths that felt like drowning. "I failed my own son when he needed me most." David and Sarah knelt beside her, their presence steady but helpless against the magnitude of her anguish. The morning sun climbed higher over the Masai Mara, indifferent to human suffering, illuminating the spot where love and duty had collided with violence and death. "Mrs. Morrison," David said gently, "Marcus didn't see it as failure. He understood." "Don't." Eleanor's voice cut through the morning air like broken glass. "Don't tell me what he understood. I was his mother. I was supposed to be there. That's what mothers do. We answer when our children call. And I turned off my phone because I was tired of his dreams." The grass around them stirred with a morning breeze that carried the scent of wild earth and distant rain. Somewhere across the plains, life continued its ancient rhythms, predators hunting, prey fleeing, the eternal dance of survival that Marcus had died trying to document and protect. Eleanor pushed herself up to sitting, her nurse's uniform, she'd worn scrubs for the flight without thinking, now stained with African dust and tears. 43 years I saved other people's children. 43 years of rushing to emergency calls, of being there when families needed help, and when my own son called 17 times in one night begging for help, I chose silence. Sarah pulled out her laptop, her journalist's instincts recognizing a moment that needed preserving. "Mrs. Morrison, may I record this?" "What you're feeling right now, other mothers need to hear it. Parents who've lost children, who live with regret." "Record what?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Record me admitting I'm the worst mother who ever lived. Record me confessing that I killed my son through selfishness and pride. Record you understanding what love really means," Sarah said firmly. "Record you learning that sometimes love looks like letting go of guilt that serves no one." Eleanor stared at Sarah as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "How am I supposed to let go? How does any mother let go of failing her child in the worst possible way?" David stood and walked to the rocks where Zara had given birth the night Marcus died. "Mrs. Morrison, can I tell you what happened after Marcus fell?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "The poachers found Zara with her newborn cubs, 2 healthy males. They were preparing to kill her and take the cubs for illegal sale. But Marcus's camera was still running, still broadcasting to our satellite uplink. The footage went live to wildlife authorities across 3 countries. Within 20 minutes, helicopters were airborne. The poachers were caught, the cubs saved, Zara survived. So Marcus's death wasn't meaningless. His choice to stay, to document what was happening, it saved an entire family. But more than that, the network he exposed has led to dozens of arrests, millions of dollars in fines, entire trafficking operations shut down." David returned to kneel beside Eleanor. "Your son's last act saved hundreds of animals that would have died without his sacrifice." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking this time, but opening. "He saved them. He saved them because you taught him how." Sarah's voice was urgent now. "Every choice Marcus made that night came from lessons you gave him. The patience to wait in dangerous situations, the courage to act when others needed help, the refusal to abandon the vulnerable. Where do you think he learned those things? Eleanor thought of Marcus at 8 years old, insisting they nurse the broken-winged sparrow back to health. She remembered his teenage years, how he'd bring home stray cats and injured wildlife, convinced they could save everything. She'd thought she was teaching him responsibility, but apparently she'd been teaching him something far more dangerous and beautiful. "I turned him into someone who couldn't walk away from suffering," she whispered. "You turned him into someone the world desperately needs," David corrected. "Someone willing to stand between predators and the innocent." The sun was fully up now, transforming the grassland into a sea of gold that stretched to horizons Eleanor couldn't measure. In the distance, she could see movement. Django's pride beginning their morning activities, the cubs playing while the adults surveyed their territory with the casual confidence of apex predators. "They're beautiful," Eleanor said, watching the lions through her tears. "Marcus died for something beautiful." Sarah followed her gaze. "They're alive because of him. Django's cubs will grow up free because your son chose courage over safety." Eleanor struggled to her feet, her arthritis protesting the morning's emotional weight. But something else was stirring inside her, a familiar feeling she hadn't experienced since Marcus's death. Purpose. The same clarity that had driven her through 43 years of medical emergencies was returning, focused now on understanding how to honor her son's sacrifice. "I want to see the hospital," she said suddenly. "The wildlife facility you mentioned yesterday." David and Sarah exchanged glances. "Mrs. Morrison, you've been through enough for one morning." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades spent triaging crises. "I've been through exactly what I needed to go through. Now I want to see where I can help." They drove in contemplative silence across terrain that seemed to shift and breathe with its own consciousness. Eleanor found herself studying the landscape differently now, seeing it not as an alien world that had stolen her son, but as the stage where he had chosen to become heroic. Every acacia tree, every termite mound, every distant animal was part of the ecosystem Marcus had died defending. The Wildlife Hospital was a collection of modern buildings rising from the savannah like a medical miracle. Rangers carried wounded animals on stretchers, while veterinarians moved between patients with the focused urgency Eleanor recognized from her own emergency room experience. Baby elephants trumpeted in pain, while lion cubs mewed for mothers who would never return. "We treat about 300 animals a month," the facility director explained as he led Eleanor through the wards. "Victims of poaching, vehicle strikes, human-wildlife conflict. We're critically understaffed, especially for trauma cases that arrive at night." Eleanor stopped at an incubator containing a lion cub no bigger than a house cat, its eyes still closed, breathing shallow and rapid. "How old?" "3 weeks. Mother was killed by poachers 2 days ago. We're hand-feeding every 2 hours, but the survival rate for cubs this young is about 60% if they receive proper intensive care," Eleanor finished, her nursing instincts automatically assessing the cub's condition. "This one's dehydrated. Have you tried subcutaneous fluids?" The director stared at her. "You have veterinary training?" "I have trauma training. Pediatric intensive care." "Bodies are bodies, human or otherwise." Eleanor moved to the next enclosure, where a young elephant stood on 3 legs, its 4th bound in bloodied bandages. "Snare wound?" "Poacher's trap. We've done 3 surgeries, but she keeps reopening the wound." Eleanor studied the elephant's posture, the way it favored the injured leg, the dullness in its eyes that spoke of pain and trauma. "She's depressed. Elephants are social animals. She needs companionship, not just medical treatment." For the first time since Marcus's death, Eleanor felt the familiar surge of professional competence flowing through her veins. These wounded animals needed exactly what she'd spent her career providing: skilled medical care combined with emotional understanding, the kind of healing that addressed both body and spirit. "I'd like to stay," she announced, surprising herself with the decision. "I'd like to work here." The director looked bewildered. "Ma'am, this is rural Kenya." "The living conditions are basic. The work is dangerous." "Doctor," Eleanor interrupted, drawing herself up to her full 5'3" height. "I've spent 72 years learning how to save lives. My son died protecting these animals. If you'll have me, I'd like to finish what he started." As if summoned by her declaration, Django's roar echoed across the distance, a sound of strength and determination that seemed to approve of her choice. 3 months after Eleanor Morrison had committed to staying in Kenya, she discovered the devastating truth that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her son's death. It came not through David's careful revelations or Sarah's journalistic investigation, but through a chance encounter with a dying poacher who confessed more than anyone expected. Eleanor was working the night shift at the wildlife hospital, tending to a young giraffe with an infected leg wound, when the Kenya Wildlife Service Rangers brought in their prisoner. The man had been shot during a firefight, his condition critical but stable enough for questioning. As the only medical professional on duty, Eleanor found herself tasked with keeping him alive long enough to provide information about his network. "Mrs. Morrison?" Dr. Kimani, the facility director, approached her with obvious discomfort. "The prisoner is asking for a priest. He says he has information about the American photographer who was killed 3 years ago." Eleanor's hands stilled on the giraffe's bandages. 3 years? Marcus died 5 years ago. "No, ma'am. He's talking about a different American. Someone named James Morrison." The world tilted sideways. Eleanor gripped the examination table for support, her mind racing through impossible connections. "James Morrison is my brother-in-law. He died in a car accident in Colorado 5 years ago, the same week Marcus died." Dr. Kamani's expression grew troubled. "The prisoner claims he killed an American photographer named James Morrison in this area 3 years ago. Says the man was asking questions about his nephew, Marcus Morrison." Eleanor's legs buckled. Sarah appeared instantly at her side, having overheard the conversation from the next room where she was editing footage. "Mrs. Morrison, sit down. You're in shock." "James came here," Eleanor whispered, the impossible truth assembling itself in her mind like a jigsaw puzzle of horror. "Robert's brother James came to Kenya looking for answers about Marcus, and they killed him too." The wounded poacher was conscious but fading, his words slurred with pain medication and approaching death. Through an interpreter, his confession poured out like poison from an infected wound. James Morrison had arrived in Kenya 2 years after his nephew's death, convinced that the official story was incomplete. He'd hired local guides, asked too many questions, gotten too close to the truth about the poaching network Marcus had been investigating. "He had photographs," the poacher rasped, his eyes fixed on Eleanor's face with the desperate intensity of a man seeking absolution. "Pictures of the American boy's final hours. Pictures that would have sent many men to prison." Eleanor felt reality fracturing around her. "What photographs?" Through the interpreter, the dying man explained that Marcus hadn't died immediately when the poachers found him. He'd been captured, tortured for information about what he'd reported to authorities, what evidence he'd gathered. James Morrison had somehow obtained photographs of his nephew's final suffering and had come to Kenya seeking justice. "Your brother-in-law threatened to expose everything," Dr. Kimani translated. "The prisoner says they killed him to protect their operation, made it look like an accident." Eleanor stood frozen in the fluorescent glare of the hospital lights, processing the magnitude of what she was hearing. Not one death, but two. Not just Marcus dying heroically in a moment of courage, but dying slowly, painfully, while his uncle, the man who'd been like a second father to him, tried desperately to find the truth. "Where?" Eleanor's voice came out as a croak. "Where did they kill James?" The poacher's breathing was becoming labored, his confession racing against time. He gave coordinates, described a ravine 50 miles north where they'd disposed of James Morrison's body, and staged the vehicle accident that had fooled everyone, including Eleanor herself. Sarah was already on her phone, calling contacts in the Kenya Wildlife Service and the American Embassy. David appeared in the doorway, his face grave with understanding of what this revelation meant for Eleanor's carefully reconstructed peace. "Mrs. Morrison," the interpreter said urgently, "he wants to tell you something else, about your son's final words." Eleanor knelt beside the dying poacher's bed, her nurses' training automatically monitoring his declining vital signs even as her world crumbled. "What did Marcus say?" The man's eyes focused on her with startling clarity. In broken English, he whispered, "He said, 'Tell my mother.'" I answered her call. "Tell her?" I finally answered. Eleanor didn't understand until the interpreter explained that Marcus, in his final moments of torture, had been delirious with pain and fever. He'd apparently believed that his death was somehow connected to Eleanor's failure to answer his calls for help, that his suffering was a way of finally responding to all the times she'd needed him and he'd been too far away to help. "He thought he was saving you," Dr. Kimani said gently. "Even while dying, he thought his suffering was protecting his mother somehow." The poacher died 20 minutes later, his confession complete, leaving Eleanor standing in the harsh hospital lighting with the weight of truths too devastating to bear. Not only had she failed to answer Marcus's calls for help, but her failure had led to his capture, torture, and eventual death. Worse, it had drawn James into the same web of violence, creating a cascade of family destruction that traced directly back to her rejected phone calls. Sarah found her an hour later, sitting motionless in the supply closet where Eleanor had retreated when the magnitude of her guilt became too public to bear. "Mrs. Morrison, we need to talk." "Talk about what?" Eleanor's voice was hollow, mechanical. "About how my selfishness killed 2 men. About how my pride destroyed what was left of my family." Sarah sat down on a crate of medical supplies, her expression careful but determined. "About the fact that you're thinking about this all wrong." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "How could I possibly be thinking about this wrong? I ignored my son's calls for help. He was captured because I didn't call for rescue. James died trying to find justice for Marcus because I was too proud to ask questions myself." 2 deaths, both tracing back to my failures. "Or," Sarah said firmly, 2 deaths that happened because evil people make evil choices, regardless of what good people do or don't do. Don't. Mrs. Morrison, listen to me. I've spent 5 years investigating this poaching network. They've killed dozens of people. Researchers, rangers, journalists, local activists. Marcus and James weren't killed because you failed them. They were killed because they threatened a multi-million-dollar criminal operation run by people who murder anyone who gets in their way." Eleanor shook her head. "If I'd answered Marcus's calls, he still wouldn't have abandoned those lions. You know that. You've read his journal, heard his final recording. Marcus stayed because that's who he was, not because he couldn't reach you for help." Sarah leaned forward, her voice urgent. "And James died because he chose to seek justice for his nephew, not because you failed to seek it yourself." But Eleanor was drowning in a guilt too vast for logic to penetrate. She saw the chain of causation clearly. Her rejected calls led to Marcus's capture, which led to his torture and death, which led to James's investigation, which led to his murder. 2 good men dead because she'd been too stubborn and prideful to answer her phone. "I need to go home," Eleanor said finally. "I need to bury James properly. I need to tell his children the truth about how their father really died." "Mrs. Morrison, I need to leave Kenya, Sarah. Every animal I treat here, every life I save, it's built on the foundation of my failures. I can't heal anyone when I'm this broken myself." Sarah studied Eleanor's face in the dim light of the supply closet, seeing the same defeated expression she'd documented in war zones and disaster areas. "What about Django? What about the cubs you've been hand-raising? What about finishing Marcus's work?" Eleanor stood slowly, her 72-year-old body moving like someone much older. "Marcus's work was about protecting families. I've spent my life destroying mine. It's time I stopped pretending I could ever be worthy of his legacy." As Eleanor walked out of the supply closet toward an uncertain future, neither she nor Sarah could have predicted that the most devastating truth was yet to be revealed. A truth that would either destroy Eleanor completely or transform her understanding of love, sacrifice, and forgiveness in ways that would honor both her son and brother-in-law's memories. The dying poacher had told them everything except the most important detail of all. Eleanor was packing her single suitcase in the pre-dawn darkness when David burst into her quarters at the wildlife hospital, his face flushed with the urgency of someone who'd been running. Behind him, Sarah clutched a manila envelope with hands that trembled despite her years of steady journalism. "Mrs. Morrison, you can't leave, not yet. Not until you see this." David's voice carried a desperation that stopped Eleanor's methodical folding of her few possessions. "There's nothing left to see," Eleanor replied without looking up. "I've learned enough truth to last several lifetimes." Sarah stepped forward, the envelope extended like an offering. "The poacher lied. About everything. We found James Morrison's real final recordings." Eleanor's hands stilled on the faded blue dress she'd worn to Marcus's funeral 5 years ago. "What recordings?" "Your brother-in-law was smarter than anyone realized," David explained. "He didn't just come to Kenya asking questions. He came with hidden recording equipment, professional-grade surveillance gear. He documented everything, every meeting, every conversation, every piece of evidence he gathered about Marcus's death." Sarah opened the envelope with reverent care, revealing a small digital device no larger than a matchbox. "James wasn't killed because he was getting too close to the truth, Mrs. Morrison. He was killed because he'd already found it. And the truth isn't what we've been telling you." Eleanor sat heavily on the narrow cot, her prepared departure suddenly feeling like another kind of betrayal. "I can't take any more revelations. I've reached my limit. Please." David knelt beside her chair, his eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. "Trust us one more time. Let us play you what James recorded in his final week." Against every instinct screaming at her to flee before learning something even more devastating, Eleanor nodded. Sarah activated the device, and James Morrison's familiar voice filled the small room, the same steady, methodical tone Eleanor remembered from family gatherings and holiday dinners. "Day 6 in Kenya. I've finally located the ranger who was first on scene after Marcus's death. His name is Samuel Kiprotich, and what he told me changes everything we thought we knew about that night." Eleanor closed her eyes, hearing her brother-in-law's voice with the strange comfort of family connection even amid crisis. James had always been the thorough one, the engineer who checked and double-checked every detail. "Samuel told me that when they found Marcus, he wasn't dead. He was unconscious but alive, severely wounded but breathing. The poachers had fled when they heard the helicopters approaching. Marcus had successfully protected the lions. Zara and her cubs were unharmed, hidden in the rocks exactly where he'd positioned them." Eleanor's eyes snapped open. "What?" Sarah paused the recording. "Mrs. Morrison, Marcus didn't die that night. He survived the initial attack. That's impossible. We have his death certificate, his burial." "Keep listening," David urged gently. James's voice resumed. Samuel and his team airlifted Marcus to Nairobi Hospital. He was in critical condition, gunshot wounds, severe blood loss, but the doctors were optimistic. I've seen the medical records. Marcus Morrison was alive and recovering for 6 days after the attack. Eleanor felt the world shifting around her again, reality rearranging itself into patterns she couldn't process. 6 days? The recording continued. Here's where it gets complicated. On day 6 of his recovery, Marcus was visited by someone claiming to be a representative from the American Embassy. This person had official credentials, spoke with Marcus privately for approximately 30 minutes, then left. 2 hours later, Marcus suffered what doctors described as sudden cardiac arrest of unknown origin. Sarah's voice was gentle but urgent. "Mrs. Morrison, the embassy has no record of sending anyone to visit Marcus, and the description Samuel provided of this representative matches known associates of the poaching network." Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the small window where the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the African horizon. "You're telling me someone murdered my son in a hospital while he was recovering?" "We believe Marcus was killed because he'd gathered evidence that could have exposed not just the poaching network, but their connections to corrupt government officials and international buyers," David explained. "His survival was a threat they couldn't allow." James's voice from the recording grew more determined. "I've obtained copies of Marcus's medical files from his 6 days in the hospital. According to the nurses, he was conscious and alert for most of that time. He specifically asked them to try calling his mother in Montana. He wanted to tell her he was alive, that he was okay." Eleanor gripped the windowsill as the crushing weight of this new truth settled over her. "The hospital called me?" Sarah nodded grimly. "We tracked down the records. Nairobi Hospital attempted to reach you 4 times over those 6 days. International calls to your Montana number. They left messages on your answering machine, messages saying your son was alive and asking you to call back immediately." Eleanor's legs gave out. She sank to the floor as memories came flooding back. Those first terrible days after receiving news of Marcus's death, when she'd been too devastated to check messages, too overwhelmed to answer her phone. She'd assumed any calls were from reporters or funeral directors, people she wasn't ready to face. "I never checked the messages," she whispered. "After they told me he was dead, I couldn't listen to people offering condolences." David played the final portion of James's recording. "The most heartbreaking part is what the nurses told me about Marcus's final hours. Even as he was dying, even knowing someone had poisoned him, he kept asking them to keep trying to reach his mother. His last words weren't about the poachers or revenge or even the lions he'd saved. His last words were, 'Tell my mom I tried to call her. Tell her I made it home.'" Eleanor collapsed completely, her body racked with sobs that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. But these weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of recognition. Marcus had survived. He'd tried to come home to her. Even in his final moments, he'd been thinking about reassuring his mother, about bridging the gap their last argument had created. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah knelt beside her, offering the comfort of human contact. "Do you understand what this means? Marcus didn't die because you failed to answer his calls for help. He survived because of his own strength and courage. He died because evil people couldn't allow him to live and expose their crimes." Eleanor looked up through her tears, seeing David and Sarah's faces clearly for the first time in days. "He wanted to come home to me. He fought to stay alive so he could come home to you," David confirmed. "Every day he was in that hospital, he was fighting to recover so he could call you himself. so he could tell you about the lions he'd saved, so he could prove that his work had meaning. Eleanor struggled to her feet, feeling something fundamental shifting inside her chest. Not the crushing weight of guilt she'd carried for months, but something lighter and more powerful: pride. Her son had been a survivor, a fighter who'd refused to give up even when facing impossible odds. "James knew," she said, understanding flooding through her. "James discovered all of this and came back to tell me that's why they killed him." Sarah nodded. "Your brother-in-law died trying to give you the truth about Marcus's courage and love. He wanted you to know that your son never stopped fighting to come home to you." Eleanor walked back to her suitcase, but instead of continuing to pack, she began removing items, folding them back into the simple dresser the hospital had provided. "I'm not leaving. Mrs. Morrison, my son died fighting to protect families. James died fighting to protect the truth about Marcus's heroism. If I run away now, if I let guilt drive me back to Montana to hide in that empty house, then I'm betraying everything they both died for." Eleanor turned to face David and Sarah, her 72-year-old frame suddenly radiating the same determination that had driven her through 4 decades of medical crises. "I'm staying in Kenya. I'm going to finish the work Marcus started, and James died defending. And I'm going to make sure every orphaned animal in this hospital knows what it feels like to have someone who refuses to give up on them." Outside the window, Django's morning roar echoed across the Masai Mara, a sound of strength and continuity that seemed to welcome Eleanor home to the life her son had chosen and the family he'd died protecting. For the first time since that phone call 3 months ago, Eleanor Morrison felt ready to answer the call her son had been making all along. Not for rescue, but for understanding. Not for guilt, but for love. Not for endings, but for the courage to begin again. Message for American seniors, 200 words. At 72, Eleanor Morrison thought her life of purpose was over. After losing her son, Marcus, in Kenya, she spent 5 years drowning in regret, believing she'd failed as a mother when he needed her most. But sometimes our greatest failures aren't failures at all. They're just stories we haven't finished reading yet. Eleanor's journey from a bitter Montana widow to finding family among orphaned lions in Africa proves that it's never too late to answer the call to love, serve, and heal. Her story reminds us that our children's legacies live on through our choices, that guilt can transform into purpose, and that the families we choose can be as powerful as the ones we're born into. Whether you're 55 or 85, whether you're carrying regret about conversations never had or dreams never pursued, Eleanor's transformation shows us that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten. Sometimes we think we're too old to matter, too broken to heal, too late to make a difference. Eleanor Morrison discovered that love has no expiration date, and neither does the chance to honor those we've lost by living with renewed purpose. Engagement. Questions. Have you ever discovered that a regret you carried for years was based on incomplete information? How did that change your perspective? If you could start a completely new chapter of service or purpose right now, what would it look like? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of second chances and late life discoveries inspire us all. Eleanor Morrison stood at the edge of the Masai Mara as the sun painted the grassland in shades of gold that reminded her of Marcus's childhood hair. 6 months had passed since she'd chosen to stay in Kenya. 6 months of 18-hour days at the wildlife hospital, 6 months of learning that healing could flow both ways, between the caregiver and the cared for. The baby elephant she'd hand-raised from near death now trumpeted with joy whenever Eleanor approached his enclosure. The lion cubs she'd bottle-fed through countless nights had grown into magnificent juveniles who still sought her comfort when thunder rolled across the savannah. Each animal she'd helped save felt like a small redemption, a way of honoring Marcus's memory through action rather than regret. "Mrs. Morrison?" Dr. Kamani approached with the respectful smile he'd developed over months of working with the American nurse who'd transformed their facility's survival rates. "The documentary crew from National Geographic is ready for your interview." Eleanor nodded, smoothing her khaki shirt, practical clothing she'd never imagined wearing in her Montana life. Sarah Whitmore had convinced her to participate in a film about Marcus's story and the wildlife conservation work that had grown from his sacrifice. At first, Eleanor had resisted, still uncomfortable with attention, but she'd come to understand that sharing their story might prevent other families from living with the kind of devastating misunderstandings that had nearly destroyed her. The camera crew had set up near the lion enclosures where Django's pride could be seen in the background. The symbolism wasn't lost on Eleanor. She would tell Marcus's story surrounded by the family he'd died protecting, the family that had ultimately saved her from a lifetime of misdirected grief. "Mrs. Morrison," the interviewer began gently, "6 months ago, you were a retired nurse living alone in Montana. Today, you're running a wildlife rehabilitation program in Kenya. What brought you here?" Eleanor looked toward the enclosures where orphaned animals played under the African sun, each one representing a life saved, a family preserved. "I came here believing I'd failed my son in the worst possible way. I learned that love is more complicated than success or failure, and that sometimes we honor the dead best by choosing to live with purpose." "Tell us about Marcus." "Marcus was—" Eleanor paused, choosing words that would capture not just who her son had been, but who he'd become in her understanding. "Marcus was someone who couldn't walk past suffering without trying to heal it. I taught him that as a child, watching me work as a nurse, but I never understood he'd apply that lesson to a pride of lions in Africa until it was too late to tell him I was proud." The interviewer leaned forward. "You've said that discovering the truth about Marcus's death actually helped you heal. Can you explain that?" Eleanor smiled, an expression that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. "For 5 years, I carried guilt about phone calls I didn't answer, believing my failure had led to my son's death. Learning the complete truth, that Marcus survived the initial attack, that he fought to come home to me, that he died because corrupt people couldn't allow him to expose their crimes. That freed me from guilt I never should have carried. But you also learned about your brother-in-law James, who died trying to uncover the truth about Marcus. James died because he loved Marcus enough to risk everything for justice. That's not a tragedy born from my failures. That's a testament to how much my family meant to each other." Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "I spent years focusing on what I didn't do. Now I focus on what I can do." The interviewer gestured toward the animal enclosures. "And what you're doing here is remarkable. The statistics show dramatic improvements in survival rates since you arrived. Animals and humans aren't that different when they're traumatized," Eleanor explained. "They need medical care, yes, but they also need patience, consistency, and the security of knowing someone won't abandon them. I've spent my career learning how to provide that kind of care." What would you say to other parents who are living with regret about their relationships with their children? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching Django patrol his territory with the confident grace of a leader who understood his responsibilities. "I'd say that love doesn't end with death, and it's never too late to honor someone by living the values they believed in. Marcus believed in protecting the vulnerable, in healing rather than harming, in choosing courage over comfort. Every day I choose to embody those values, Marcus lives through my actions." You've become somewhat of a grandmother figure to the local staff and the international researchers who work here. "Family isn't just about blood," Eleanor said, watching as young researchers carefully tended to injured animals with the dedication she remembered from her hospital days. "Family is about choice, commitment, and showing up for each other. I've found more family in 6 months here than I had in 5 years of isolation in Montana." The interviewer's final question came with obvious emotion. "What do you think Marcus would say about what you're doing here?" Eleanor looked directly into the camera, speaking to an audience she couldn't see but somehow felt connected to. Other parents, other people living with regret, other seniors who believed their most important work was behind them. "I think Marcus would say I finally answered his call." Not the phone calls from that terrible night, but the deeper call he was making throughout his life. The call to use our skills and experience to heal the world's wounds, to protect those who can't protect themselves, to choose love over fear in every decision that matters. As the camera crew packed up their equipment, Eleanor walked among the animal enclosures she now knew by heart. The baby elephant she'd saved wrapped his trunk around her arm in greeting. The lion cubs she'd raised scrambled to the fence when they saw her approaching. Each interaction reminded her that healing flowed both ways. She'd come to Kenya believing she needed to atone for failures, but had discovered instead that she had gifts the world desperately needed. That evening, as she did every night, Eleanor sat with her laptop composing emails to her church back in Montana, to neighbors who'd wondered what had become of the widow who'd disappeared to Africa. She shared photos of the animals she was helping, stories of recovery and resilience that paralleled her own journey. Pastor Williams had written back with news that the congregation was raising money to support her work, that her story had inspired other members to consider how they might use their skills in service of something larger than their own comfort. Mrs. Henderson sent care packages and updates about the small Montana town that felt increasingly like a previous life rather than home. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a message from David, working late at the research station. "New arrivals tomorrow, 3 orphaned cheetah cubs. Are you ready for another sleepless week?" Eleanor smiled, typing back, "Always ready. That's what mothers do." She saved her work and stepped outside into the African night, listening to the sounds that had become her lullaby, distant roars, the rustle of grass, the breathing of sleeping animals who trusted her to keep them safe. Somewhere in that darkness, Django was watching over his pride with the same protective vigilance Marcus had shown, the same commitment to family that had ultimately brought Eleanor home to herself. At 73, Eleanor Morrison had learned that life's most important chapters often begin when we think the story is over.